Hi, Al. My name is João Barbosa. I'm sports physical therapist in Brazil. I'm very happy to be here with you attending this event, the International Maldia Health Science Congress. I'm very grateful with the invite to speak for you related to my research that it's about hamstring strain injuries in soccer players. I work with professional soccer players in Brazil, so it's very grateful for me to share with you some of my clinical practice knowledge and my research knowledge related to hamstring strain injuries. I am here speaking with you because I was in US working with Umut. He was here with us working on his postdoc. So I make part of the same lab from him, that it's the Badger Athletic Performance Lab in Wisconsin. I'm an invited researcher here too, and I'm finishing part of my PhD here in the US. And all my formation was related to sports, PT, and I will be very, very happy to discuss with you in the future, maybe presentially in Maldia, related to sports injury. So I love to do that, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share with you all this knowledge. Okay, so when we think about return to play, the main goal in any injury, not just in hamstring that we're going to speak today, is to put the player as soon as possible back to the field. And we need to do this with balance, because we need to do this kind of approach with security. We need to avoid that this player can have some kind of re-injury. We need to work with this balance, and I will try to show you how you can work with this balance during the hamstring rehab phases, okay? The first phase goal of the hamstring rehab is to start to put the player in the movement. And we can start this load procedure with some isometric bilateral hip dominant exercises. But we're gonna try to go from these more simple exercises on this first phase to some more huge exercises, like the knee dominant eccentric exercises. A great way to start this exposure is to start with some hip dominant eccentric exercises. So we will start to put some load at the hamstrings, but it's not a big load, because you have, for example, in the hip thrust, this exercise that I'm showing you, you have a lot of activation of the glute max. So maybe you can start this kind of approach soonly, so you can start fast to put the player on this kind of load. For every exercise and every increase of load that we are supposed to do during this time, we will respect this VAS. So the player needs to feel in the max of the VAS, the number 4. Related to his pain during the exercise. So if it is necessary, you can control the range of motion, you can control the load, you can move the feet back, for example, to put less stress in the hamstrings and more in the glute max. So if the player is not answering well to the kind of load that you're putting, you can control this range of motion, and you can control the load if it is needed. Since it is possible, we're going to start with some unilateral isometric exercises. Every time that the player don't feel pain, you can try to go to another exercise, and in this new exercise, if he feels pain below 4, it's everything okay. So you can work with a little bit of pain. There is no problem. After we start the unilateral isometric and the player answers well to this kind of load, we can start to exposure him to the bilateral hip dominant eccentric exercises. One of these is the 4-5 hip extension, and another one is the bilateral slider. So the first one, it's easier for the player, and the second one, it's more difficult, related to the hamstring load. So maybe your player can feel very good in the first one, and maybe he can feel some pain on this one. If the pain is below 4, it's everything okay. You can keep the exposure. Some double leg stabilization exercise can be used in the beginning. And since the player is feeling the pain below 4 for it, is doing great, it's answering well with the load, you can evolve to single leg exercises. Some exercises that work the synergies between the flexors and the hip extensors can be great on this phase too. So in this first phase, we don't have the running exposure yet, because we are starting to create a load capacity on this player, and we need to improve this load, mainly related to the eccentric capacities, before we start the running exposure. So to progress to a second phase, we have some criteria that needs to be reached. The first one is that for a unilateral hamstring isometric contraction, the player can't have pain. And we can compare the previous data of the muscle strength of this player for the hamstrings with the actual data that we measure on this phase. And we can see how much this player is below or above. That's very difficult, but sometimes below from that previous value that we had, or a normal data related to players from the same position can be a way to look for this data. The palpation pain needs to be below 3 on the VAS, and the maximal hip flexion and knee extension test needs to be with pain below 3. And the maximal hip flexion and knee extension test needs to be with pain below 3 too, and close to a 80% LSI. So comparing both limbs, we can have a deficit at maximum of 20%. And this player needs to be able to complete the bilateral knee dominant eccentric exercise with complete range of motion and pain below 4. So since he reaches the capacity of doing this kind of exercise, for example, the slider with full range of motion, the phase 2 goal is to progress to a unilateral knee dominant eccentric exercise, and in the end of this phase, to start the running exposure with a low intensity running in the beginning. So since our player can have an eccentric complete range of motion with pain below 4, we can start the Nordic exposure. So we do the Nordic twice a week on this program, and from 4 to 6 reps and 2 sets in the maximum on each time of exposure. We can start the unilateral knee dominant eccentric exercise since the player can do the Nordic with pain below 4. And for all the exercises, again, we will look for the pain, okay? So we can start with this kind of eccentric exercise and then progress to a unilateral slider exercise. So we're going to start this running exposure with a low intensity running protocol. So the player will run less than 7 kilometers per hour twice a week. It's a really small running exposure. And we can do it with 35% compared with his game distance. So since we reached the last phase of the phase 2, we have the criteria to progress to the phase 3. So these criteria are related to palpation, pain below 3 again, and absence of edema. We don't want edema anymore for this next phases. The maximal hip flexion and knee extension test needs to be with pain below 3 again, and then LSI close to 85%. The single leg bridge test, that is this test that is on my slide. We expect that the player can do more than 25 reps during this test in a unilateral bridge with the knee flexed in 20 degrees. Related to the single leg bridge test, we have the unilateral hamstring isometric test, and we expect more than 80% of LSI at this phase. And we just progress to phase 3 if our player is answering well with a unilateral eccentric exercise with complete range of motion and pain below 4 in the VAS. So the phase 3 goals is to progress from a low intensity running to a unilateral power exercises, and in the end of this phase to running coordination retraining. So we can start to load the eccentric exercises. So since we add load, we're going to come back to bilateral exercises like this, like the pelvic elevation with heel support. We can start the weightlifting exercises if the player is not answering well to our big range of motion. To try to keep the player in this pain threshold, we can work with some range of motion limits. Since he answers well with load in some weightlifting, in some eccentric exercise, even for bilateral, still you can start the jump and the power exercises progression. So you can start with some squat jumps, and later you can progress to some lateral or some horizontal jumps. Since this player is answering well to the bilateral power exercise, you can try to progress to a unilateral power exercise. And we can start this progression by lateral or forward jumps. For the running coordination, we can start with some ankle and knee dominant running coordination, like this one, before you progress to this kind of hip dominant running coordination exercise. So you can progress to this kind of running coordination exercise since you have the security that your player can feel the pain below 4 on this kind of exercise. If you do that first exposure before this, maybe he will be very good to do this one. There's no problem. For progressing to the phase 4, we have some criteria again. The palpation now needs to be absence of edema and pain. The maximal hip flexion and knee extension test needs to be absent of pain again, and the ELSI can be close to 85%. The Askling age test, that is this one that is on my slide. You can scan the QR code. You can see how to do this test. Needs to be performed without pain and without apprehension too. The hip dominant running coordination exercise needs to be completed and with the pain below 4. Since the player can do the hip dominant running coordination exercise, we can progress to the phase 4 goals. So we were at the running coordination retraining, and now if the pain is below 4, we can start to progress to single leg explosive strength exercises, and some kind of explosive running field exposure. The explosive strength exercises can be performed with the kettlebell swing or with some kind of deadlifts related to some rubber bands or just with the weight. But the main secret of this kind of exercise is that you can address the eccentric phase with slow exercises, and in the concentric phase, the player needs to explode during the movement. So this is called explosive strength. And this is our main goal on this phase. And we can progress to some kind of deep squats, looking more for a unilateral explosive strength. And later we can go to a field exposure. This field exposure starts with some kind of explosive running, that it's running between 7 and 14 kilometers per hour, 3 times a week, with 13% of total running distance in a game. So it is not a sprinting exposure yet. It's not even a high intensity running exposure. It's called just explosive running. And in this phase, you can add on your drills some kind of ball exposure to some kind of pass and kicking drills and dribbling drills and some kind of accelerations and decelerations. We can start to address the accelerations and decelerations at this phase, because this is very important in a game. And there are some papers that show that when you have a huge increase on the number of decelerations and accelerations, not just the total running volume from a player in a game, it can be related to hamstring injuries. So it's not just the total running volume, but the total accelerations and decelerations in the game. This is very important too, and it's important that you address this at this phase. Since the player can do the explosive running exposure and change of direction in a field exposure, we will start to progress to a high-speed running field exposure. And in the end of this phase 5, we will start the sprint exposure, the maximal speed running exposure. So the criteria to progress to this phase 5 are related to the maximal hip flexion and knee extension test with 90 of LSI or close to the previous values of the player. And the player needs to be able to do some loaded explosive strength exercises without pain. So he can be able to support this kind of exposure, this kind of exercise. So load explosive strength, followed by some running drills. And the chronic explosive running load rate of 13% of total running distance in a game, and the chronic load rate of 45% of total accelerations and decelerations in a game. The next phase of the field exposure is related with the high-speed running. For the high-speed running, the player can run between 20 and 25 kilometers per hour. So we can do some kind of drills like this, where you have acceleration and deceleration time. It's very important that you have some drills related with decelerations and accelerations in a game. And now we can increase this load. We were working with 4 or 5%. Now we can work with 50% of this total acceleration and deceleration in a game. And you need to put on these drills some kind of change of direction. We can't forget the loaded exercises, and now we can put this load on unilateral eccentric exercises. So the unilateral pelvic elevation exercise, it's a great one, more related with the hip dominant exercises. But if you keep your heel in the support, you have a big load on the hamstrings too. You can put some load in the Nordic. If your player does the Nordic like this one, so he can go until the end. So you can put some plates on his chest and you can add some load. We need to improve the single leg power exercise. So you can go to some kind of fast power exercises, and you can improve the range of motion of the power exercises too. Since this player doesn't have pain to high intensity running and to this kind of power exercise, and he has no apprehension to running in high intensity and to change direction and to kick the ball, you can progress to a sprint exposure. To the sprint exposure, we need a chronic high intensity running load rate of 6% of total running distance in a game, and a chronic load rate of 60% of total accelerations and decelerations in a game. Since the player match this criteria, you can go to exercises like this, some kind of sprint exposure with some curves. This is the maximum. You need to ask the player to do his maximal sprint exposure. We will not stop with the high-speed running exposure in the field, taking into account the player's position and the total decelerations and accelerations. And we will gonna add to this high-speed running exposure some sprinting drills. And for these sprinting drills, the player needs to run in his maximum. So the sprint is running above 25 kilometers per hour. So is the player max during all the time. The player is exposure to a high speed running and later to a sprint maximal running. So normally we match the high speed running drills with the sprint. So we add some kind of sprint or maximal running drills on the high speed running exercises. We have some criteria to return to performance too. So the player needs to have on unilateral hamstring isometric strength test 90% of LSI or 90% compared with some previous or normal data that you can have. We just not address the hamstring strength, but we can address the unilateral gluteus maximus isometric strength test too, and we expect the same values. For the single leg bridge that we used in some phases before, the players needs to complete more than 30 reps. And we have some field tests too at this phase. So the player needs to perform the T agility test below 11 seconds. He can't have pain and apprehension to sprint and change of direction and kick. He needs to accumulate a chronic sprint load rate of 3% of total running distance in a game. He needs to accumulate a chronic load rate of 80% of total accelerations and deceleration that he does in a game. And he needs to be exposure to explosive high intensity sprint total running distance, acceleration and deceleration load rates of at least 50% of total in a game. So the total running distance needs to be at least 50% of what he does in a game. It was a pleasure to be here with you. So here are all my contacts. I will be very happy to discuss with you related to hamstring injuries or to this lecture. So I will be very, very happy to talk with you on my social media. And again, thanks for the invite, Burku. Thanks for the invite, Umut. And Dunyada is Birak.